And we are live with Dr. Charles Cole, back again this morning. Dr. Cole, as you know, is an author, an activist, the founder and the leader of Energy Converters in Oakland, California, moving into Chicago and Kentucky, maybe coming to a state close to you. Energy Converters works with youth to have them lead from the front, have them be the ones who decide their future, have them be the ones that decide what policies work best for them, and for them to have some feedback loop with older people who tend to run the world without ever checking in with younger people. Charles, welcome.
Hey man, thanks for having me. I'm glad anytime I get the alley-oop, man. I'm glad you hit me up.
I appreciate it. For watchers, listeners, Charles is a utility player on the team of the 8 Black Hands, meaning he can jump in and really help out with almost any issue and bring clarity to almost anything that we talk about concerning education and a certain realness. Today, Charles, I want to talk a little bit about the so-called school to prison pipeline. We've been talking about it for years. We have heard about it for years. We have some sort of vague understanding of what it means. But the individual person in our community listening to the so-called, the rhetoric around the so-called school to prison pipeline doesn't have any actionable things that they can do to address it. So it could be that you just become nihilistic about it. Like, listen, I know it's a problem. I know it's something that we do, but it's going to be what it's going to be because I really have no concrete things that anybody's helping me to do. I want to talk about that today. I want to see if we could just talk about the issue first, but then see if we can get to a place where we have some concrete things that we could be saying. Friends and family in the comments, if you have any resources, any articles, any thoughts, suggestions, any places that you think we're not hitting on, please put it into the comments because the comments make us all smarter about these issues. Charles, yesterday you pinged me with an article that I frankly can't believe. And even as I posted it up to other folks, no one could really believe it. A teenager didn't do her online schoolwork, so a judge sent her to juvenile detention. A 15-year-old in Michigan was incarcerated during the coronavirus pandemic after a judge ruled that not completing her schoolwork violated her probation. It just doesn't make any sense, says the girl's mother. And every thinking person across the United States says the same thing. Man, let's start here with this. Tell me all the things that we pull out of a headline like this that give us signals about what we're dealing with when it comes to education in schools.
Yeah, well, one, I came across this. I was just looking up something else, and I came across this. And also want to shout out Ray. Ray had also, when I posted it in the group, he had let me know he posted it on our public page before or whatnot. And I guess it's a story that's starting to catch. But basically, the general gist is there was this young girl who was on some type of probation with juvenile hall. And she didn't go on and do her distance learning or whatnot, and they use that as a violation of her conditions, and use that as an opportunity to put her, to lock her back up. And the story is it sounds crazy, right? And it sounds like an excessive force of amount of bullying, which it is. But I think the thing that's more crazy about it is that I don't think that that's the first time something like that's happened. I mean, I know we're in this new moment with distance learning, but this type of stuff has been happening for a long time in other forms. Again, I've often talked about the parents that are put in jail for trying to find a better school for their kid. There just seems to be too many stems and roads where kids can go from being a child in one moment to being a prisoner of the state in another moment. And our schools shouldn't be tied to that type of just filth in my mind. So that the story is just crazy because it's like, wait, that's what you use to prosecute this person. So it was just tough to read. I don't know if we'll end up covering it on 8 Black Hands as well, but it was just something that had caught my eye. And it's like I often felt like this growing up, that you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't type deal. And this is one of those things that's like, if you're trying to do better, even if let's say the girl was being defiant and didn't do her work, is that grounds for her to have to go back to like being locked up in the way in which they did it? I mean, so it's still kind of raw for me, just like on dealing with it. But I try to deal in like what solutions are and what people can actually do. So I'm applauding all these movements around trying to get to the systemic issue of it. And I know systemic work takes time and we often don't get there, but there also has to be somebody in addition talking about what can happen right now. And I try to focus on that right now space. Maybe it's the social worker in me, maybe it's the way in which I kind of grew up in it, but I didn't feel like I had these type of protections. So I think that's what that brought up for me.
I think it's really interesting that there are a lot of people that actually don't believe that the school to prison pipeline exists and that it's a thing. So we actually have a little bit of convincing to do with a big part of the American public who actually don't even believe that that it exists. I have some information here from some stuff that I was looking up last night just to say, what do people mean when they talk about the school to prison pipeline? Corrections funding in the United States is a $75 billion in industry just on the incarceration of incarcerated people. It's $100,000 per prisoner. Actually, ask yourself what you could do with $100,000 per person besides put them into jails. You know, over 20 prisons were built in California since 1980, and fewer schools than that were actually built during that time, even as the population of students with needs actually grew. Prison demographics, as you know, skew against people of color and definitely against low-income people. 1 in 4 Black males will go through corrections in their lifetime. But what does this mean for education? I just gave you jail statistics. Those are just about prison, about jail and whatnot. What do schools have to do with this? When you think about schools, kids being pushed out of prison, school to prison pipeline exist on things like students of color facing harsher discipline. 40% of students expelled from schools each year are Black. So we're only 12% of the American population. I don't know the exact population percentage we are in schools, but we're 40% of those that get expelled in the schools. 70% of the arrests are Black or Latino in schools. 70% of the arrests. We're 12% of the American population. The Black students are 3.5% times more likely to be suspended and spend time out of school. There's a statistic here that I can't believe. So I actually have to go back and check this out. If anybody is on the record here listening right now who could quickly fact check this, this says 68% of males in state and federal prison do not have a high school diploma.
Yeah,
68%. Damn, I mean, like as cynical as I am, I fall out my chair even thinking that could be true.
I mean, you got to understand where this stuff is kind of based in, right? Like I just did a presentation here in Oakland about the history of Oakland, of OUSD, which came to be about in like the late 1800s. And one of the people that built out our system and our program was a student of this guy, Lewis Terman. And Lewis Terman was a eugenicist. And just so you understand how they thought about us and how they built this out, he said low intelligence scores are very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families, and also amongst the Negro. Their dullness seems to be radical. It seems to be racial. In the near future, intelligence tests will bring tens of thousands of these high-grade defectives under the surveillance and protection of society. So basically, this is what he said. He was at Stanford, and he had a student of his, Dr. Virgil Dixon, ended up becoming the head of research for Oakland public schools. And through that, they helped build the tracking system. So it was basically, we are going to make sure that these Black, brown, Mexican, Native kids end up where they belong, which is back under our control. Now that there isn't a traditional slavery form. This is when you talk about the school to prison pipeline, like these things don't just happen on accident. It's not like supremacy was just a happy accident that happened. It was people with foresight and thought that created this stuff and had power. So the same seats that I sat in and worked in, right, like as a professional, were once housed and owned by people who were eugenicists who thought that we belonged behind in cages. So that's how these things happen. So
how? So wait a second. Say again who he was.
So Lewis Terman, he was a cognitive scientist and eugenicist, but he was the mentor of OUSD lead researcher, Dr. Virgil Dixon. and this is around like the late 1800s, 1900s or whatnot. They wrote a few books, but they ended up talking a lot about how we needed to sort kids in certain ways, right? So the same sorting system that started in the late 1800s, early 1900s is what my campaign at Energy Converters has been all about. When I talk about A through D access, who gets access to these classes, and like I said, it started from a very personal place. A really good friend of mine was a year behind me in school, and this is how these things happen. And I went off to college. I was local, and he was up there with me the full year. So as a senior, a young Black man, as a senior in high school, being on a college campus for your full senior year, you get excited about college for a few different reasons, right? And he got his grades up, and he graduated with like over a 3.0 GPA, but couldn't even take advantage of the largest public college university system in the country because he didn't have the A through G requirements. It wasn't even on the table for him, and he tried to sell drugs for a little bit, and gladly he stopped and ended up going to the service. But the point that I'm making is that that's how these things kind of happen. If you can suck the hope out of somebody and then you suspend them a few times, you get them used to being institutionalized. You get them used to getting talked to a certain type of way, boys and girls, because it happens to our girls as well. This is what happens. And now, when you're so good at it, people even question if it's a real thing. That's how you know they were really good at what they did.
When you say they, you mean so good at being a school to prison pipeline that it's almost like they can gaslight us real easy. They can be like, it's all in your mind.
Yeah, it's seamless. You know what I mean? And it's seamless, and it's been able to progress for a long time. So, I mean, I wanted to just make sure that we understood these underpinnings. And this is just one story about Oakland, right? And what
that's crazy though.
Super progressive lands, right? You know what I mean? Let's think about all these other places. I mean, listen, man, I think there's a lot of people that get that doctor title and make things sound more complicated than it needs to be. I think our job should be the opposite. I think it's taking very complicated things and let's be very simple about it. We are in a country that at some point was comfortable and able to own people. And then one day the law says you can't own people no more. And this is the source of our wealth. This is the source of our resources. And so they're like, well, we need to supplement this. We need to make this thing like, how do we further implant this, right? And then you build out a prison system with ties to our young people, right? And you push them into that. And then you have a system that's thriving even better than when slavery did. And on top of that, we now have the global market that we also can take impact from, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the super up here, like, super like woke type answer or whatnot, right? Around how this thing happens. But I like having conversations. Well, what can I do about it? What can if I got a kid right now and I'm afraid for my son, I'm afraid for my daughter. And I think there's some few things. I think one, you got to communicate. I think that you have to have a relationship with your school, even if you hate it. And what I'm even just to understand where they're coming from or how they see you and how they see your child, I think you'll learn very quickly. But if there are certain questions that you ask an educator, if you ask a teacher or a principal and they can't answer, those are your first red flags. So if you say very clearly, what's the discipline policy here? Like, what if my kid gets in trouble? What's our relationship gonna be? Do we have somewhere you call me first? You know what I mean? Does he get his name on the board? Does she, have to write lines or whatever? But just getting very clear and at least starting that conversation, because you'll find out a lot of places actually don't have a policy, right? And they just kind of shoot from the hip. And the reason why that's a problem is Black girls and Black boys are seen as older than what they are. They're seen to be able to tolerate more pain than other people. So there may be a Black little girl in agony and she won't get the same sympathy because of implicit bias, which I hate that term because it just assumes that people are not aware of what they're doing. But she won't get the same like reaction from the adults around her because she's simply a Black girl or because of how she talks or what you think about her parents, right? So I think that this is just is really important for people to understand. So one, you got to go up and talk to these people. I think two, you got to get some partners in the community. That means you got to become friends with some other parents at the school. You got to become friends with one of those teachers. Like you got to become friends with the people leading your church groups or whatever. You just need a community around you that whenever there's some BS, they can step in on your behalf. So that was the role that I served as a social worker quite often for families that didn't know their rights and things that they had struggled with for months, Chris. I would walk in and I say a few terms to let these people know that I know what I'm talking about, and that whole problem goes away. It's crazy how that happens, right? It's crazy how when I show up, we got the right classes now, right? It's like going to buy a car. If they feel like you don't know anything about cars, if they feel like you just thirsty and hungry for a vehicle and do anything, they're gonna try to pull you across the coals, right? But if you bring somebody that know what they're talking about and they know that they need to get this sale, then you end up getting a better deal. And that's just the way that the world works right now. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying that's how it should be.
It's just how it is.
It is.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting when let me just tell a quick story. So I go to my kids' school, and I've told the principal this story multiple times. Last year and in years past, when I would go and have lunch with my kids, I would every now and then catch a glimpse of stuff that people didn't know I was catching when we would be engaging. So one example of that is going into the lunchroom. And I found one of the lunch ladies. My kids had always been telling me that they get treated like crap at lunch and that the lunch people are really mean. And I always just blowing it off like kids saying, oh, they're mean. But I walk in and this teacher or aide or whoever it is in a kid's face and has this ugly look on her face and is really kind of just like giving it to the kid and looks up and sees me and her entire face changes.
Yeah.
Right. Like her face softens and it's like, hi. And like in that moment, I'm thinking, damn, you went from rah, rah, rah to, hey, how you doing? In like 0, right? Which tells me, number one, you know that you were wrong. You know that and there are things going on in this system you don't want us to see. When I think about the roles, if, and I'm just gonna say if, the school to prison pipeline is real and it's a problem, and everybody needs to take responsibility for it, and everybody has a role to play in it being and happening and fixing it. Let's just start at the beginning. What's the parent's role in addressing the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah, so the parent, you got to be the captain of your team. Like, you don't have to know everything and be perfect, right? Like, and I don't care if you got a first grade education or a PhD, right? Like, you got to be the captain of that team. And what that means is you have to assemble the other players and kind of have a plan for your child's future and an envisionment of it, right? Now, it might not go exactly like that, but where there's no vision, the people perish, right? And so that's not true anywhere else than with your own kids. And as that, right, you start to amass people and you collect people. And then on top of that, the school shouldn't be the only place. And I've said this before, like, we depend on our schools a lot, but it shouldn't be the only place where you're getting kind of fed and getting what you need for your kids. So, you know, if you got a little black girl, you want to put her around successful black women. You want her to see different things. You want to put her around successful black men, but you want to expose them to other things and other ways of life. And I think you want to have conversations with your child early on so you can help set a standard, you know. So, you know, this is one of the things I appreciate my grandmother for. I was raised kind of by my grandmother until she passed. And one of the things that she always kind of would tell me is that I don't care what they're doing out there in the world. This is what I expect you to do. This is who I expect you to be. And, you know, and her thing was, you don't need nobody else's approval but mine. Mine, and well, honestly, she would say hers and the Lord's, right? But you don't need nobody else's approval but hers and the Lord. And I think for me, that helped me out a lot, especially after she died and I went on that journey and I ended up in all those different schools and in shelters and stuff. It allowed me to be independent in a sea of craziness and in a sea of mess. But my grandmother instilled that in me when I was 6 or 7 years old, right? And then she died. And it's something that stuck with me even to this day. And so I think that you do the best you can. You're not going to bat 1,000, but I think that really communicating with your child and building them up enough at home, that means that when something off happens at school or happens out on the playground, they actually feel different talking to you about it. They feel like they got an ally in you. And the worst thing I think for a parent, and again, I always say this, is I'm sensitive that I know I don't have children, but I'm talking to people about their kids. But this was my job for 5 years. But I've seen so many parents, the most regretful thing when something happened or we had to recover from something really crazy happened was when their kid would express that they felt like they couldn't talk to their parent. Like out of everything that happened, that's the thing that had crushed more parents that I had to work on repairing and rebuilding for them, because those are the type of blows that you don't come back from. Like if somebody touched your kid and it was happening, and then they do all that work, and then they say, well, I didn't feel like I could talk to you. That's hard to come back from, right? So now let's think about the academic and educational malpractice that happens to kid, which is the same type of abuse. And then later on in life, and your kid is like, well, I didn't want to stress you out. I didn't want to do this to you or whatever, right? So I think it's being very clear with your kid, like, look, regardless of what's going on, regardless of what I'm going through, regardless of how I may be messing up or whatever, I'm always here for you. You are my top priority, and we're going to get through whatever we need to get through together. I think the camaraderie between child and parent is probably the strongest thing to combat this stuff to start off.
You know, that's the parent. So as we transition to the role of the educator, the role in perpetuating the school to prison pipeline, but also in ending it, because that's what we're talking about today, is stop talking about the problem, admit that it happens, and start ending the problem. Lots of people working on it, but do common people know how to get in on the ending it part of this game? But before we switch over to what the educator can do, and, you know, I just want to put it out there, we criminalize low income people more than we do middle class people. So if I have a problem with your school, and like you just said, you know, you would show up with parents, and it's amazing how things would be different. It would be different too as a parent, if you were a parent, and me as a parent showing up. This that I'm putting up on the screen right now is the human cost of Kamala Harris's war on truancy. And it talks about a law that she championed in California that criminalized truancy in kids. And if you had more, I want to say it's more than 10 absences, it started triggering a criminalization process of parents. This was not an inconsequential law or policy to pass, because people actually started getting hung up in the criminal justice filter, because their kids were missing school, and it started creating additional problems in terms of things like you could actually go back to jail if you didn't pay your truancy related fines, for instance, right? So now it's costing you money. It's not just costing you time. You're not just being criminalized. Now you're poor already, but now you're on the hook for money and for fines that you don't have, which further tumbles you into the criminalization net or filter, whatever you want to call it. And this is real. This is something that a person who, you could push this as a progressive, you could push an issue like this as a progressive, and no one's going to call you on it, really. Like, I know there's some backtracking about this, but it's long after the fact. You know, this was something that people championed, not just on the right, for instance, by the way. Like, this is something people champion. My kids can have more than 10 days off, and I don't give a damn, right? Like, I make the decision. And I understand that there's people in the world who believe like that could be educational neglect. It could be a lot of things. I know, but what it can't be is it can't be that I'm going to have a problem as a middle class person versus the low income people. I'm not going to have a problem as a middle class person if we go over 10 absences, because people are going to understand the world differently for me than a low income person. What do you think about the ways that we have to reverse these I don't know what you would call them, double standards in how we treat poor kids versus how we treat middle class kids and their parents?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think part of the reason why the 8 Black Hands work is because we see things in a variety of ways. I see this as like a Serengeti and this whole thing. And if you are a predator in the wild and you're hungry and your job is to hunt and bring stuff back, you're not looking at the prey and you're looking for the strongest prey. You're looking for the weakest prey. You're looking for the prey that don't have a support system around them. You're looking for the one that might be hurt or whatnot. Well, being poor is almost equivalent at times to not have, it means you don't have the support, you don't have the resources. If somebody does something to you, you don't have lawyers on deck to come and sue the hell out of the school and the system, right? So you make rules and you make laws that actually impact those people that's kind of got to just deal with it. So that's one of the reasons that you see that, right? Like, they're not going to go after middle class and upper class families because they know they'll fight back. But when we make these laws, right? Like, Chris, you said this before, that our children are the new cotton. And you actually weren't that far off from that. Let's go back to slavery and the 3/5 law. Now, when we talk about the 3/5 and people make, oh, we was considered 3/5 of a man. Actually, that law is one of the things that helped end slavery. Let me tell you why. It was employed by the South that said, look, we actually have more representation. We need to be able to count these slaves that we got. It wasn't that the North was just benevolent and hated slavery.
Right.
Some did, but they was like, no, you're cheating. You don't get to count those as people, even if it's the 3/5. And that was part of it. And that helped to spark the Civil War when the South, when they did the 3/5 compromise or whatever, right? So in this 3/5 compromise, in today, is your kids, is poor kids being stuck in schools that we tell them that they gotta go to. And if they leave it, they gotta get papers from us. And if they don't get those papers, we'll put you in jail, right? Like people are still yelling for Breonna's killers in Louisville, where close to where I grew up, right, to be put to trial. We catching parents off of like address fraud, like during pandemics. Like we are putting kids in jail for not signing in and logging in to do virtual learning, right?
Now, so that's such a good point. Like that is a huge point. It's compulsory for you to go to school. By law, you have to be there. Yeah. They don't care about you anytime more than the beginning of school and October 15th, because that's when they get their money for your head count. And then they really don't care about you for the rest of the year after they get that money, once they get that head count for the year. But you have to be there, but they don't have to teach you, right? You don't have to like actually learn. So you kind of are a modern version of the slave in a very polite form, though, because like people who listen to this could obviously say, oh, that's so dramatic. Slavery is so much worse than these schools are. Debbie Meyer here has something, all these statistics astound me. Every time I read any of them as they come out of my mouth, I'm like astounded. But Debbie Meyer says 50% of prisoners in Texas were found to be functionally illiterate due to dyslexia. Literacy prohibits success in school, but has nothing to do with intelligence. So 50% of prisoners have trouble reading, and they are functionally illiterate, which causes you problems in the real world. When you start thinking about what's the connection between jails and schools, you have to ask yourself the question of people in jail: why didn't you learn to read? What happened for you for 12 years that you were in the care of professionals? Professionals with benefits and pensions and summers off. And for 12 years, they had you, and you're functionally illiterate sitting in jail. Now, that's where the connection starts to become clear for me, right? So if we wanted to be revolutionaries and radical, we would have to actually put reading on the radical agenda. I mean, that would have to be something that we would continuously push until it was fixed, right? Like, because you can't read, there's a lot you can't do.
Right. I mean, listen, man, when you think about it, I don't think it's dramatic at all. It's not the same thing as slavery, but what I'm saying is the underpinnings that we built up in slavery, like those tenants, people get upset when you take their cash crop away. And for a long time, we were that cash crop, right? And so what you just talked about, Chris, you said, how does that happen for 12 years and you leave not being able to read? Well, think, I don't know. I went to a traditional public school. I went to Westlake Junior High School. I love that school. I'm an Eagle for life. I made some of my best friends there. But down the hall, around the corner, there was a set of a few classrooms with Black kids that looked like me that I played with on the yard, outside, or whatever the case was. And they was in special ed. But it wasn't nothing wrong with them. But they had to go to school at a different time. They were already isolated. They always had like the CO. I mean, it's basically our security guard officers were always down there if something broke out. Like it really was a baby jail. It was baby prison. And many of those kids went from that baby prison inside of our school to juvenile hall to San Quentin. And it's not by accident. It's not by accident the type of stuff that happened at that end of the hall. And we didn't know about it now. And then you go back and you listen to people like a Jay-Z or a 50 Cent. You find out, oh, you was in special ed? Like, 50 Cent was like, oh, they had me on. I was on Ritalin since I started school. Like,
my favorite story is Chance the Rapper. Chance the Rapper was going to a fairly well-to-do school in Chicago. Was getting suspended a lot. Got a 10-day suspension, I think, for weed or something. And in that 10 days, he wrote his first mixtape, and it got downloaded 500,000 times. Right? So we have I'm not going to say this is the upside of suspensions. We have a chance to rapper because he got suspended, but it's because the reason I bring it up is because the brilliance that is in him that created the mixtape that got downloaded 500,000 times on his first shot out was the same brilliance that was in him the day he got suspended from school.
But peep this, Chris. Let me tell you what's crazier about that. He got juice. His dad is connected. He's true. He is like firmly middle class, and his dad was in politics. Like his, you know what I'm saying? So if that's happening to him, you know what I'm saying? And he got a nuclear home, he got this stuff or whatever the case is. The point is that when you build a system, systems are built to run and function, whether you are conscious of it running and functioning or not. So that's how this works, right? So again, as we pivot to the educator, right, the role in that, in the book and the research that I did, every case that I did that made it in the book, Chris, they had a teacher or somebody in the building that had to essentially break a law to serve them properly. They had to break, not a law, but protocol of the school. They had to step outside of their class. They had to step out and call that mom and say, hey, actually, they about to check. They're going to test your kid for this. You should actually test him to see if he's gifted. Like there was always somebody that had to step and break from this wall and like actually be a co-conspirator with these families. Now, damn. So I got to be great and lucky, and I got to have somebody willing to put their career on the line to serve me. I worked so hard to get here, Chris. Like I'm exhausted. Like I'm really thinking about leaving education work. I'm gonna be honest with you, right? I worked so hard to be here, and the amount of luck that went into that is the thing that makes me sick. I still had to be awfully lucky. I still had to make sure that, you know, and look, man, a lot of times, Chris, and I talk to you about this a lot, there's a right answer and a real answer. Like a lot of people giving you the right answer, right? I think when we talk about systemic this and breaking that down, and here go a real answer too. What part of what saved me, and me and my dad didn't always get along, but my dad was bigger than me and he could beat my ass. I'm just gonna be honest with you. It just was certain things I wouldn't do.
Okay, now see, this is gonna be a different show for a lot of people, but we've talked about this before. Your dad, a healthy fear of a father.
Yeah.
And makes a difference in a person's life. I just want to say it's a real thing.
Well, and he didn't my dad didn't just beat on me. I'm talking about the threat was real.
Right. It was a real threat.
That was enough. And it was basically like, oh, when my friends started acting out in the classrooms, I couldn't join that. I couldn't stay out all night. I couldn't do those things. Again, I'm not talking about what the right answer is. I'm saying in my life, that was something that actually changed things for me. For somebody else, it was their mom. Like in that book, it was one of the kids' moms was just a writer. Every time they had something to say about her kid, when they antagonized her, she just antagonized them back. And she said, is your son on drugs? She said, yeah, you want some? We got some for you. Like her thing that she was saying was, you're not going to talk bad about my baby in front of me and in front of my baby. I don't give a damn what he did. You're going to respect who he is. And that's something that stuck with him, right? I think different things can work for different people. The point that I was making, I'm not telling people what parenting is and all that stuff, because God knows it was a lot of mistakes made. What I'm pointing out is that there was a lot of luck that had to mix in with the level of work that I also had to put in as a young person. Like that Black achievement trauma tax is a real thing when we wrote about it, because oftentimes when a Black kid goes to college and graduates, that's the end of the movie. We don't hear about them 20 years later. We don't hear about them with a wife. We don't, or a husband, or with kids, right? Like there are some people that worked really, really hard and actually, quote unquote, kind of beat this system, right? But then they find themselves deeply depressed in their 30s, 40s, and 50s because of what they had to endure just to get a good education. So it's either don't get an education, I end up in a Texas jail and I'm illiterate, or go all the way to the top and become a doctor and get all this stuff. And now I'm super like depressed and don't know how to really interact with the world because I had to be on tilt just to get here. And if you telling me those are the options, then damn, how do I just opt out this whole system?
I mean, and a lot of people don't have the benefit of opting out of the system. Like right now, we started this with a story about a person who, a child who goes to jail or, gets incarcerated basically for not doing her online work.
Right.
Right. And we're about to switch to more online work. Right. We're about to have, and there's cities like Los Angeles who had, I think, tens of thousands of kids that they couldn't find that never logged on. Like once they started doing the distance learning, and those kids will be like easy ones to capture and to be punitive with if we allow it. if we allow it to happen. You just said something though about the credible threat of your father. So your father, like I've always called it a healthy fear of your father, right? Which means your father's there for one,
right,
and two, that your father cares enough to actually be that credible threat. This is what I love about your story every time you bring that up, because I'm like, if you didn't think that the threat was credible,
right, it's not,
right, it's not going to work. But the fact that there was a credible threat that you might face discipline or whatnot teaches you something in of itself. Now, there's two ways you can go with that piece of information. Like the liberals and conservatives will go different directions with it. Conservatives will go straight to, okay, well then fatherlessness is the problem, right? And it'll be a simple reductive argument that they'll make from that. And to which I think progressives, liberals, libertarians have to fire back and say, well, if you actually believe that father presence in the family is important, why did you spend 20 years incarcerating them for small amounts of drugs, right? Why did you have a drug war that you knew by the numbers the entire time was taking large numbers of men out of communities for a 600 times difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine? I can't say it enough. No one has ever apologized for that. No one has ever formed reparations for 2 decades of taking men out of the community and putting them in cells and then sending them back to the communities worse off, right? Like you're going to have them for all these years and you still not doing anything with them while you have them to capitalize them and send them back to the community better. So it's hard when you start untangling these balls about like the school to prison pipeline and you can't address multiple systems.
Right.
You can't talk about multiple systems. Like mass incarceration has something directly to do with family deconstruction, which has something to do with how kids show up at school. And then once they get to school are not being taught. And then because they're functionally illiterate, they go to jail, right? It's a vicious cycle. In that cycle is an educator. There's a teacher. Kids coming into the classroom right now today. What is that educator's contribution to the school to prison pipeline, and what is that educator's potential for ending it? What's their role in addressing it?
Well, first off, they got to make a choice. Is your goal to educate and build up children, or is your goal to be part of a system? And you need to know who you are first, and you need to know what you're willing to pay. And what I mean by that is, again, if you are working in the type of schools that we are talking about, you're going to see some stuff, and how you move after you see it will tell a big story. So your role is first to make sure that kids are safe and that you're doing your job and kids are learning, that you're preparing them. And part of this that I want to like really say is there are a lot of teachers that'll give a kid a break, right? And sometimes they think they're giving them a break, but they really just lowering the bar. And they do it because in part it makes them feel better. And it makes sense because everybody wants to feel good. But I remember when I was running a youth organization and I had people that were well-meaning and would do this. And I said, look, man, they not going to be with you after this. Like, don't make them dependent on you. If you are an educator, your students shouldn't be dependent on you. You should be working yourself out of a job. You should be getting to a point at the end of the year where you don't need me anymore. Go off and do something else. You're prepared, and I've prepared you for that because life is throwing jabs, man. They throwing haymakers. So I think that's first off the thing. Are your students prepared once they leave you to go on and take out that phase of the world? I think too, is sometimes you got to be willing to kind of break some company policy, man. Again, when this whole thing started, I have friends that teach and their union told them, you cannot contact kids while we're negotiating. You cannot contact family.
Oh, damn.
And she was just like, no, I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. And if you want to fire me, right? Like my families need me and I've built relationships with them. And I think that tells into it is like build actual relationships with the people. Listen, it's easier to talk about somebody when you don't know them, right? Mm-hmm. Will and Jada is all over the place or whatever. But I bet everybody that's actually met Will and Jada Pinkett Smith don't feel the same about putting up a meme about their situation that's very personal and private. Like, so the same is true with kids, right? It's hard. You can't watch a third grader get hauled off by police in cuffs if you know that kid. Mm-hmm. If you truly know his family, his people, and where they come from, you can't just sit there and watch that. Like every time I see that happen to a young person, and I don't see an adult getting dragged out behind them for whatever, It tells me that you actually nobody really had a real connection with that kid, at least the way that they thought they did. So what that means to me, Chris, is that I know you and I don't know your kids, but I know you. So if I see something in a school and an adult dragging your kid, I'm going to jail. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I think the last part is community. You know, there's benefits to live in all the places that I lived growing up, but Kentucky had community like no other. Like, I'm telling you, I got in trouble one time by one of the other adults, and my grandmother looked at him and said, "Well, did you beat his ass?" Like, he know that what he was supposed to do. Like, I can't be everywhere, right? And I knew never to do whatever in front of Mr. Johnson or whoever, right?
Because he had been given.
It's snitches everywhere. Like in that Kentucky small community, it's snitches everywhere. But the Bay Area is a lot different. The Bay Area always feels transactional. It always feels like you're lonely, even though it's super crowded and overpopulated, right? You need a community of people. At least start with 3, then have it be 5, have it be 8. I have another friend, and his son just graduated and went off to college. But from the moment his kid was born, I knew them when he was about 10, but every time his kid did something good, he made his kid come in front of this group of men. And every time his kid did something bad, he made his kid come in front of this group, right? And I bugged out because I had never seen that. Because again, me and my father's relationship was what it was. But I was like, oh, snap, like you're building accountability from men, and in a way, you helping us out as these men, because now we know this kid is watching us. So when I'm trying to I'm trying to have a drink or something or do whatever, I'm like, oh shit, little such and such is watching me now. You know what I mean? And it actually kind of made me better. But that's what communities do. Communities don't where you are. They build you up.
There's a higher level of parental alienation now than I think there ever was. Meaning that you are more isolated now than you ever were. When I was growing up, you could always get a cup of rice, a cup of sugar, a cup of milk, regardless whether you had money or not, just through the neighborhood. Like, and the way I know this was I was a smuggler. I was a runner. So I'd be sitting there watching my little MTV, thinking I was like special, sitting underneath the air conditioning in the one room that had air conditioning, my grandmother's room, rest of the house hot as hell. And every 10 minutes or so, my grandmother would come running into the door, be like, boy, go take this to Miss Celestine's house. This is, and it'd be rice or sugar or butter. And then go to, Miss Cecile's house and pick up such and such, whatever, a pickle, a pig foot or whatever. And Miss So-and-so needs you to run the store and get her 1 cigarette, a pig foot, and some lunch tongue or whatnot.
I know about that 1 cigarette.
Buying 1 cigarette at a time used to make me so mad because I'd be like, I was like a slave. They would just send me out in that heat and that humidity to go get you 1 cigarette. And then they would send you back after they smoked the one with another nickel to get another cigarette. And I'd be so mad, cussing the whole way. Just get yourself a damn pack. Why don't you buy a pack, damn it? I always say this to say, another addition to that was, I remember getting busted for cutting school once. But my grandmother knew before I even got home that I cut school, that I had went to the plaza, went to the mall. And by the time I got home, she was like, how was your day today? So tell me what you did today. Me being dumb and stupid, just answering questions and making stuff up. She knew the whole thing, right? I broke one of the emblems. In the 70s, there used to be these emblems on cars, like Grand Marquis, the Cadillac, the Grand Marquis, the Benz. We didn't have any Benzes, but we had a lot of the LTDs and those things. And I used to just want to see how they work. So I flip everybody's down and break them just going home. And I mean, come on, you got to have some fun. And by the time I got home, I caught it for that one because you think you're not being watched. You being watched, right? It's like that Rockwell song. I always feel like somebody's watching me, right? But now today, when I started working in social services, I would help moms go shopping for their groceries. I'd help them as they were pregnant throughout the time, deal with social services and all this stuff. It amazed me how many of them were completely alone. Like living in an apartment, nobody next door. They couldn't even trust their neighbors in a lot of cases. No cousins nearby, no way to get some rice in the middle of the night if they needed it or whatever. And that's a bigger thing, which means to me, to your point, we have to build more community around. If we care about children, we have to build more community around their parents.
Yeah. And I mean, absolutely, man. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just think it's important.
No, go ahead. I mean,
it's hard to do anything alone, man. It's hard. Part of the way even the 8 Black Hands came together, man, like, and we probably wouldn't just say this out loud, but we felt alone in our work oftentimes. We would come and we would end up gelling and having these conversations and be like, yeah, right. And it's like, well, shit, I just fought these cats by myself. Like, I've been fighting these people. And, it was kind of selfish for us because it was like some solace in each other around it. And you need that as a parent. You don't have to know everything, man. Like, and that's the thing. Like, these people will have you thinking that you crazy. That's the first rule, right? Like, you go into that school, every time you go, it's traumatizing for you because one, you remember what they did to you, and two, they try to make you feel stupid. You know what I mean? Like, try to talk over your head. It ain't that complicated.
It really isn't.
It really ain't. Like, and people, I know it's hard to teach a kid, but it also, like, we romanticize that narrative as well. Like, my grandmother did a great job teaching me, and she didn't have a whole bunch of education. And as me and you always remind people, Chris, the biggest, largest, hardest moment of growth in reading for Black people came right after slavery with people that had nothing. So, like, and I think that there are new ways for people to build community. Even in this comment line, right, of all these people, that's a community. So I know that if I got Miss Johnson's kid on here and something's happening and she ring the alarm, and then you got Ray and Christina and Toya and them people, and them people showing up at your school or showing up in your inbox or whatever, we have to start moving like that.
Honestly, like, that's so powerful. Charles, that's so powerful right there. Like, you bring 2 or 3 people with you, and first of all, your confidence goes up. Your ability to, like, whenever you go to school, you should move as a team. I'm saying this to parents right now. You should move as a team, never move alone. Welcome to the Terror Dome. You should definitely move as a team because parents go into these schools oftentimes so kind of like already kind of have made themselves small. They feel that the words that they're saying aren't going to be, the Queen's English or the right way of saying stuff. So you're not going in there with enough in you about the position that you play in your child's life. Like, you are the superpower in your child's life. You can't roll up in these schools acting small and have people talk over you and tell you what's going to be, especially in IEP meetings, especially in discipline meetings, anything that you might need backup. You might need to bring 1 or 2 people. And like the people in these comments, you might need to bring 1 or 2 of these type of people with you.
Absolutely.
In the comments. So Vivette Dukes is in here, and Vivette. I can imagine if I had a problem in school with them trying to over-criminalize my child and I brought Vivette with me, it would be a different meeting.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't it? It'd be a much better meeting.
And you need everybody. I mean, that's the thing, right? You need somebody with the social work language, that actually the educator language, and you need some people that's ready to get it popping. And I'm looking in your, I'm paying attention to the comments. There's somebody that said kids who sell drugs deserve to be in jail or whatever the case is. And I hear you, but like, listen, man, when I
hear them, you agree with that?
Well, I don't agree with them. This is what I'm saying. When I did in the 90s, at the height of the crack epidemic in Oakland, in the 90s, early 90s, it was 70% of Oakland students were impacted by crack directly, meaning they were either using it, selling it, had parents that were using it or selling it, or that had been victim to some type of violence in relation to drugs. 70 to 75% of all those kids. So all them kids deserve to be in jail, or as NWA has so eloquently said before, we ain't got planes. Like, this stuff got here.
No, I mean, that's the point right there. This is where I agree with his point. Whoever you are, Gordon Fiala, who said that child who sells drugs in school deserves to be in prison. That's gang affiliation. There is no excuse. They are sexually abusive to children too. I mean, man, this is like a gumbo of stereotypes. But here's where I agree with you, Gordon. I do agree that children who sell drugs in schools should absolutely go to jail, but only under a couple of conditions. Like, one, they have to be the one that got on a plane and went to Havana and other countries and got the drugs to bring them into the United States and brought them to their communities. Because then I might agree with you. They also have to have worked with the CIA over 2 or 3 decades to make sure that they had the appropriate connections. Because I'm all for criminalizing children and putting them in jail forever as long as they're the ones that worked with the CIA to get on planes and make connections with major drug bosses in other countries to make sure that their drugs show up in Compton and Gary, Indiana, and Detroit and Milwaukee, keep going down the list, New Orleans, right? So those kids, put them in jail, absolutely, and throw the book at them. If you find me a 10 or 12 or 14-year-old who actually went to another country with the CIA and brought drugs into our country, I say throw the book at him. Don't you, Charles?
Absolutely. Yeah. That little mastermind with all that access and all that loose cash and money to buy kilos and turn it into coke and take it and break it down and to crack. I mean, here's the point though. And right, when you talk, what you mean as a gang and what I see as a gang might be two different things also, right? Like I live in the most, I grew up in the most liberal place in the United States, the Bay Area, baby. And we had a law here that 3 or more of us assembled and dressed alike were a gang. Well, I played basketball my whole life. I had friends. We stuck together. And the uniform for black kids when I was a teenager was jeans, some white Air Force Ones, and a white t-shirt. So we just all a gang. I mean, listen, man, like there is so much in that comment. I don't even want that to take me off track, right? I want to make sure that we stay focused. The point that I'm making around all
this is where it's important, though, Charles, because other people will share that narrative. Mm-hmm. In the general public, there is a sense of, when you talk about all of this, there's a sense of we need to be more punitive to kids, right? And over the last year or so, there was a little bit of unearthing, like the genesis of the super predator mentality in policy, right? So I'm old enough to remember that being something that was shared across the aisles, across political parties and sides. We got to address these super predators. And, there was this made up fictional representation of kids just wilding out, which didn't actually end up being statistically true
right?
In any way, shape, or form. But it drove a lot of policy. It drove a lot of school policy for years.
Well, I'm gonna take a page out of Sharif's book and add a little bit of Ray in there as well. And I'm gonna read something real quick. And it's from actual research. Crack hit East Oakland hard in the late 80s. From 1980 to 90, Oakland experienced a 2,200% increase in the amount of drug-related cases. It's estimated that there were roughly 36,000 drug users in 1990 in Oakland, 40% of which were women. Of the women that gave birth during this period, 30% of babies were born had been exposed to drugs. 70% of the emergency room cases at Oakland's County Hospital Highland involved acts of violence that were in some way drug related. The influx of crack cocaine affected 70% of the Oakland students in grades 7 to 12 in some way. Donald recalls seeing kids as young as 11 years old selling drugs. Donald personally experienced a rise in violence and remembers that there were rules that emerged as a result. The point that I'm making is this, man. This is what I grew up in. And by that guy's, like, by his own testament, I am a criminal. I deserve to be in jail from the things that I've seen, the things that I've endured, and the rules that I had to adopt just to kind of be able to like survive in those places. And I'm not special. It's a whole generation of folks, from Chris Stewart to Ray to Sharif, from whatever. You have 4 people that y'all love now, right? Everybody loves us because of this podcast or whatever, right? But when you dig into each person's story, you find some stuff. It's like when Chris talks about living in a car and like what it took to get to where he is and the things he had
actually
to do.
2 cars. So one was a Corolla. One was a Corolla, and that was in East Oakland. When Corollas were popping, you could at least make them a little bit popping. And one was a Ford Fiesta. And I like to remind folks, I had roommates when I was in a Ford Fiesta. Yeah.
And were your roommates just the epitome of legal justice and moral authority at that moment?
No,
as y'all were trying to survive in a Corolla?
They just smell bad, bro. That's all.
The point that I'm saying is that even in that research, I use pseudonyms of real people in my life that were killed or went to jail to describe 3 other kids that went on to become doctors. The margin is so thin, man. I could have easily, Chris's story could be so, let me tell you, I'll take myself out of it. Chris Stewart's story could be so different if a few things didn't break his way, coupled with how hard he had to work. So what that means is there are people that are working their ass off and doing everything they can in this society and still gonna get the short end of the stick, man.
Mhm.
So if we're gonna have this conversation, let's have this conversation.
I will say this much too, though, going back to our point about it takes a village and everybody has a role to play, and we need to build community around kids. I failed dramatically in school. I failed dramatically in my first years of leaving home and my first years of being out there, and all the way up until the time that I became a parent. I actually was expecting to live my life that way for the longest term. I will say this much, though. God worked in my life. Oftentimes there were aunties, there were, cousins, there were strangers, there were adults all over me in different places who I can pinpoint different times in my life where it was like that story where you could either go left or right and door one or door two. And God placed a person in my life at each of those doors that got me through. Here's the red pill and the green pill or the blue pill or whatever, take the right one. And I can imagine just there being an absence of adult in any of those specific doors, and my life would be different. I probably would not be having this conversation. I do want to I know we're rolling towards time. I want to make another point, and then I want us to end on some positive things that we think Absolutely. Are tangible and concrete that people can do. And folks listening and watching, please in the comments help us out. Offer us one thing in the comments that you think, or two things, or three things that you think the average person, average citizen, mom, parent, community member, activist can do to contribute to ending the school to prison pipeline rather than talking about ending it. So put those in the comments right now if you have them. This point that I want to make, this last one, I had more I wanted to say about this and get to it, but
sorry.
No. You've been very helpful to me in this because I need help like a lot of other people do. I need help in thinking through how you get out of the rhetoric and how you crowdsource ideas about folks. How are we going to free ourselves?
Right.
Like, who do we know? Who can I talk to who's going to help sharpen my thinking and add something here? So I want to show you Aaron Benner. Let's see if I could pop this in here. So this is Aaron Benner. Aaron Benner is a St. Paul teacher, St. Paul, Minnesota teacher who went on to make notoriety nationally, got invited to go see Betsy DeVos, got invited to Fox News, was on the O'Reilly Report, made national news because locally he had come to school board meetings to say that racism had nothing to do with why kids were being suspended so often. He literally said, exact words, that they act like thugs and then they get suspended. And that's the problem. It's not that he's a bad teacher. He says he has excellent classroom management skills. He is Black like they are, and he's been punched before. He's had them cuss him out before. And when he brought this up, the district found many ways in which he was deficient, so he became a martyr. So the right wing picked him up and said, see, here's a Black teacher who is saying that these kids are basically thugs and that's their problem. This dude has made national news and has had speaking opportunities across the country. And as you can see by the picture, this is not a white person. So as much as we talk about racism and whatnot, we have to keep making sure that we talk about the system having the ability to put anti-Blackness in anyone. Right? It actually could be part of your job, regardless of who you are. In there, as I said earlier, Kamala, who I actually really respect for a lot of reasons, was the one who really pushed the hell out of that law to criminalize parents. Right? I only bring this up to say, let's not be deceived and think that this is just something where some group of people needs like a equity and inclusion training or something like that. It's the system. The system, as you said, as you laid out, the design of the Oakland schools, right, was by somebody who had anti-Blackness as a major part of their resume, right? Like the connections that you made here to slavery and to other things, it's the system. And anybody who goes into that system can either be a revolutionary or complicit in our own demise and our own destruction. That's my only reason to bring up this Aaron piece. And I would encourage people to go and read more about Aaron because I think it's such a stereotypical case of what we need to be thinking about. So as we wrap, I have a couple of things that I think are important. Do you want to go first with a couple of things?
You go ahead, brother.
So teaching tolerance has some very specific things that I think teachers and educators need to be looking at about the school to prison pipeline. I want to just refer to a book called What Great Teachers Do Differently. I think that's the name of the book. If it's not, correct me, I'll find out. I'll go back and find it. I have the book. And the only thing that I took away in the book was that it says in one part of it, it talks to a principal who said every year he knew at the beginning of the year that he could predict which teachers were going to send the majority of the students to him for correction of some sort, right? And it had to make you think, wait a second, how can he predict which teachers in his building are going to send the most number of kids to him for discipline and which ones aren't going to do that if they're teaching the same kids, right? Well, he could predict that because he knew for some teachers that was a default. Sending the kids for discipline was a default. Making sure that they get the kids out of the classroom is a pedagogical strategy for how they're going to be successful. So teachers need to understand that they can be complicit in the school to prison pipeline. When you make that action to send that kid for discipline, you are setting them off on a boat towards the sea of racial inequality. You have to think about that. I'm not saying make sure that you keep a bunch of kids in your classroom that are disrupting everything or whatnot, but we need some better strategies. So here's what Teaching Tolerance says: avoiding the pipeline. How can school districts divert the school to prison pipeline? They can increase the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports. They can compile annual reports of the total numbers of disciplinary actions that push students out of the classroom based on gender, race, and ability, and perceived ability. They can create agreements with police departments and courts to limit arrests at school and the use of restraints such as mace and handcuffs. They can provide simple explanations of infractions. That's a big one to me because the infractions have weird names and titles to them. Prescribed responses in the student code of conduct to ensure fairness. They can create appropriate limits on the use of law enforcement in public schools, and they can train teachers on the use of positive behavioral supports for at-risk students. That's from an educator source. That's from a source that's talking to teachers. Mine are more simple than that. I wrangled over this, like what would I tell an activist? And then I don't have anything profound because I'm still working on it. But if you are watching this and looking at this, I know so many people in this timeline who are activists who just jumped out and started doing something. They actually just started getting involved in some way, shape, or form. And it wasn't because they had a PhD. It wasn't because they had years and years and years of working in a school as an educator. It was because they had the self-confidence to know that they have a role in playing and freeing our children. So I would say, like them, what I've learned from them is commit to change. Commit to not just talking about it, but make a commitment. And I would say, like dieting or anything else, make it a public commitment. Declare it to your friends and family. I am this year going to work on dismantling the school to prison pipeline. Declare it and make sure other people hear you declare it so that there can be some Christian accountability for the things that you say that you're going to do. Number two, I think you need to get the local data. Get the receipts. Make the school district tell you things that they don't want to tell you right now, like which schools are most responsible for making the most number of police calls. How many police calls are made? Which classrooms are driving those police calls? Get the local data and the receipts, because without data, you have no activism. The third thing is find other people of like mind, find organizations that are already working on this issue. Dedicate time. If you're going to declare it and tell people you're going to do it, dedicate some time to it. The fifth thing or the fourth thing is to look for a policy that you want to push. It's not enough just to show up, just to talk loud, just to do whatever. That's a first part of it. And just to have the data, but actually work with people to create what is the world we want. What do we think is a good policy? What can we offer as a positive rather than a negative? What is working somewhere? And then push it, push the hell out of it. Run that ball as far as you can run it and stick to something simple. And then the last thing, I think your commitment has to be to committing to being a thorn in the side of the people who have power, whether that is your school board, whether that is your superintendent. They need to see you enough times where they know you're coming back. and they're going to see you again. And until they form some sort of committee or task force with some power and some teeth, that they're going to keep hearing from you. So that's all I got. Those are 5 things that I think I've learned from many of the people who are actually in this timeline and other activists that I know. So that's mine, Charles. What would you say?
As it for educators, who do you want it to be for specifically?
I think parents, really.
Oh, parents, perfect.
Yeah, go back.
I'd rather do parents. You the expert on your kid. I don't give a damn what your past is. And again, like, a lot of times we feel so ashamed about where we came from and what we weren't able to do that it's hard to get back on track and support your people or whatever. But you the expert on your child. And you got to be the captain of that team. Now, I mean, you got to know everything and do everything, but you got to take the responsibility on and make sure these things happen, because you and that kid got to live with the results. Not that educator, not that system. It's y'all that got to live with it. I think communication is really, really important. You will find that you make some allies and you're going to make some enemies. And I think that knowing where you stand is really important. And I think building out a community. So even for the people that's in this group, if y'all don't know each other, y'all should exchange information, right? Again, if one of these people's like, look, this is what's going on at my school, and these are the ins and outs, and I need y'all to send an email on my behalf to such and such, I think that's powerful. I think that we have to, as a parent, you don't always know or harness the power that you got. It's like having a 20 in your pocket and not knowing it's there. You can still starve because you didn't know you had money, and you do. And I think 3, finally, man, is that sometimes we got to have things supplement the school building, especially depending on where you live. It's not fair. It's not okay. It's not right. But my first speech that I gave, I get to go and travel the country giving talks. It wasn't at school. It was at church, where I learned how to be a leader. Was at the boys club playing basketball with like a coach or whatnot. Right. Like, and then I think that there are just other things that you have to offer your kids. Like, you can still get to be that teacher. Like, my grandmother loved to cook and loved to bake and plant stuff or whatever the case is. Share those things that you hold dear to your heart. Continue to pass those things down. I think finally, and it sucks that we got to add this now, but it's so much gentrification. There's so many places being remarked and renamed. Is you got to be a griot and help keep that community's history alive. I live in Oakland and I can see Angela Davis down the street. You'll just see her having coffee, right? Like, or Elaine Brown or whatever. When I'm in Chicago, there's people that tell me about the history of my people in relation to that city. And Kentucky has a whole gaggle of history. And I'm sure wherever you live does as well. So I think having a connection to who you are, especially because so much of our history was stripped away, it's going to be even more difficult for these new generations, because not knowing who you are is hard to get a foot in. And a lot of us know what it's like to float around trying to figure out who we are as adults. So I think those are some things that can help. And then I would say, you can be hard on yourself, but also you're not going to get it right. You're not going to be perfect. I don't know if it's just written in the code that as a parent, you got to be a tortured soul or whatever, but forgive yourself and just, tomorrow's a day to be better and go from there.
Dr. Cole, Charles Cole. The show always gets better, man, when you come on. I appreciate it. You add energy and realism to the show. I really appreciate that. I can call on you anytime and we can talk about almost anything and it gets smarter on this show. So I appreciate you, brother. Thank you for coming
anything
on.
I can do to help, man. Thank y'all to the Citizen Ed folks.
Well, to all the folks watching and listening in this today, I did see some stuff pop up like Vivette Dukes is somebody who can help you. Her email address is vivette@npunion.org, and that stands for National Parents Union. So the National Parents Union is an organization. I talked this week with their founder and president. Vivette actually is one of the local parent unions reps, and you can talk with her. Tafshir Cosby Thomas. Hers is TAFSHIER @mpunion.org. You can find these in the comments here too. So if you're listening to this later, you can find these people in our comments. Dr. Toya, I think it's Dr. Toya, actually is always somebody who you should reach out to, talk to. Christina Laster is someone who does a lot of action on the ground. I think you should talk to her.
Hey,
Debbie, Christine is amazing. Elaine Wells, thank you for being here and participating. Debbie Meyer, somebody in this feed, please seek her out. She has lots of information around dyslexia and reading and literacy. There's no way that we can be serious about any of this if we're not serious about our kids reading on grade level, hopefully above grade level. Let's stop setting low bars. Let's start setting high bars. Are they reading ahead of grade level? I appreciate you all. This is something I do every morning, and the best part of it is seeing everybody.
Toya's fan page. Toya built a fan page for the 8 Black Hands that covers Chris's show and all our other stuff. So you got the 8 Black Hands page, which Ray's holding and doing a great job with. You got Toya that just made this fan page, and it's amazing with a whole bunch of stuff. So thank y'all for doing that.
Definitely see that fan page, because if you join and you commit to it, you'll find additional information from Charles, from me, from Ray, and from Sharif. So do that, but also look at the people in this feed here and connect with each other. There is no power. We will not win against white power and against the white supremacist system. We will not beat it alone and as individuals. And the system loves to make us into individuals who will act alone so that we can be depowered, so we could have no power in changing our circumstances. What you need are friends and family and connections and comrades who can work together and have each other's back. Never move alone, move as a team. There are connections that could be made in the people that are in this timeline right now and in others that could be brought into it that can create real small local movements. I believe in little revolutions. I don't believe you have to boil the ocean and get everything right the first time and have some big splash and do some big thing. Small actions, small things chip away at the big problems. There's a big tree, you have a small axe ready to chop it down, So do that thing, man. Do it together. I will end by saying this too. I've said a lot, but I will end by saying this. I have to tease you all about my show tomorrow. Sharif El-Mekki and I will be back tomorrow for another Freedom Friday. And
it's top secret or something, huh?
Top secret. It is a special edition. Usually on Freedom Fridays, we talk about Black educational history and great people within Black educational history as a way to keep the public engaged in the truth about us and about the way that we approach education. But tomorrow's show is a little different. It will be educative, and it will be informative, but it will be different than the rest of the shows we do. It's top secret. It's classified. I can't tell you what it is, but you need to watch it tomorrow if you want to hear something powerful that you may not know in our history. Thank you all for watching. Appreciate you, Dr. Cole. Appreciate y'all.